We're doing a four-part series on the topic of the law, looking at the Old Testament, first 5 books of the Old Testament, known as the Torah, or the teaching. And we're doing this because so much of understanding the gospel and the rest of the New Testament, it's rooted in the Old Testament. We have to understand major portions of the Old Testament to fully understand what the New Testament is. The law, as we looked at last week, are these directives given from God. And if we go back into the history of Israel, these laws were given to make them stand out as different from all the surrounding nations, so that they'd be an example to the world and people would be drawn to knowing the one true God. And we ended last week with the challenge to say at the core of the law is trust. When God gives a directive, do we trust that there's good in it, or are we thinking, no, he's got alternative motives? And so the challenge last week as we ended is, do you trust God, period? This week, we're going to pivot and we're going to talk about the different parts of the law, the different parts of the Old Testament law. There are about 613 laws in the Old Testament, or rules to follow, if you will. And I want to start by giving us a picture just in modern day society, how we operate in the same way. There are different parts of the law, even here in New Hampshire. I'll give you some examples here. So as we look into purchasing property for Mercy Church, there are zoning laws and there are codes that we have to abide by. For example, how tall can a building be before you have to get a variance or an exception to the rule? What do you do in relation to wetlands, and how much of a border do you have to have? How many entrances can you have to a church building? How many parking spaces do you need based on the attendance? Those are all laws that we have to follow. And they may not feel super relevant to you, but they are at the center of my life right now in a way I never expected. So if you want to talk about zoning enforcement, let's chat. But that's an example of some of the laws that we have to follow that maybe have relevance at one point, but feel less relevant at another point. We also know that there's criminal law or moral law. If I went onto this property that we're looking at and just started hiking around, I could get found guilty of trespassing because we don't own the property. If I went into the property and started cutting down trees because I wanted some wood, I could get arrested for stealing because it's not our property. We understand that there's criminal law that has to be followed as well. And then we also know that there are laws that feel relevant sometimes and not relevant other times. So for example, when you have to pay your tax bill, all of a sudden the tax laws become very relevant to you. Maybe the rest of the year, not so much. Or when someone comes to your door, like somebody did to us yesterday, to market or to talk about the candidate they want you to vote for, you start asking different questions about the law, like how much money has this person received from in-state versus out-of-state groups? There are certain laws about what money you can accept and you can't accept. And so we know in our day-to-day, the law has relevance, but it impacts us in different times in different ways. When you're driving down the road, and just at the last minute, you see that police car sitting facing the opposite direction, and you look at your speedometer and go, I'm 12 over, the law comes front and center, right? You're looking in your rear view to see if the police officer is going to turn around and follow you. That did not just happen to me 2 days ago. But here's my point, is to say that there's law that we follow today. Some of it feels more relevant and less relevant. When we go back to these 613 laws in the Old Testament, they're broken, generally speaking, by theologians. They're broken into 3 main areas. So I want you just to think about this. And again, this is not just an academic study, because as you read through the Old Testament and you connect it to the New Testament, you'll start to get a more robust picture of the story of what God is doing in the world. But these 3 areas are the moral law, the civil law, and then the ceremonial law. Again, the moral law, the civil law, and the ceremonial law. Now, there's no place in the Old Testament where there's a list that says this is one set of laws and another and another. But as you read through the Old Testament, you'll start to see, yeah, that makes sense as a way of breaking them down and thinking about them. So we're going to talk about those 3 areas today. And next week, we're going to look at some of the particular laws that are really, really weird. And we're going to talk about, are they relevant today? How are they relevant? How do they connect to you and me? But the moral law, for example, we see it summarized effectively in Exodus chapter 20. If you were here last week, we went through the 10 commandments, or should I say, the 9 commandments, because I skipped one last week. Only 2 people came up to me to bring that up, so I'm concerned, but that's between you and Jesus. Okay, So here's a picture of the moral law of God. Here are the moral things that we're called to do. You shall have no other gods before me. You're not to make any idols. Don't take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Keep the Sabbath day holy. Honor your father and mother. Don't murder, commit adultery, steal, or bear false witness, and do not covet. Those are moral directives from God, things that we should not do or should do, depending on how it's phrased there. Here are some other ones. In Leviticus 19:15, it says, do not show partiality or favoritism in judgment. That's great. That's a good law. Don't play favorites when you're making a judgment. Do not oppress the poor, the widow, or the stranger. We see that in Exodus and Leviticus. Do not seek revenge or hold a grudge. Leviticus 19:18. Do not defraud or withhold wages from a worker. Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 24. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. Leviticus 19. Practice justice and equity in all business dealings. Leviticus 19, Deuteronomy 25. And I can go on and on and on. But these are moral commands from God. And going back to the context, he was saying to the nation of Israel, this is the way to live rightly. These are moral directives, things that express my heart, my righteousness, my holiness. And I want you to live this out toward me and toward one another. I just wrote down that if we did not have the New Testament, and we didn't even have all of the Old Testament, we just had the first 5 books, the Torah, and just these laws, the 613, and then we honed it into just the 10 commandments, if the world would follow the 10 commandments, we would be in a better place. Right? If there's just some very clear things, like here's how you're supposed to live, and here's how you're not supposed to live. And I want to point something out that I think is really, really interesting. Over the years, people have made the argument to say these moral directives are not fundamentally things that come from a Christian worldview or a Christian ethos or the Bible. This is just how people are wired. Right? We know the right things to do and the wrong things to do. And there's truth in that because Romans 1 talks about the fact that we have a conscience, but our conscience knows, broadly speaking, right and wrong. And the thing I found really interesting as you delve into this more and more, we're now seeing people who have ridiculed the Christian faith deeply for years and years say, maybe there is something to the morality that Christianity teaches. Listen to this really interesting fact. So Richard Dawkins is a well-known atheist, maybe the most well-known atheist in the world right now. A handful of years ago, there were 4 atheists who sort of popularized atheism to the world and Western culture. They were known as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse sometimes. And so these people made it very easy to understand atheism, and they made it popularized in such a way a lot of people became fans of these atheists. And Richard Dawkins continues to be at the forefront of this. He wrote books like The Blind Watchmaker, The God Delusion, more recently, Outgrowing God. And so do you get the sense like he's not pro-Jesus, okay? But in a recent interview, this is what he said. I love this so much. He said, I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there's a distinction between believing Christian and following the ways of Christ and being a cultural Christian. I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. And he brought this up because he's from the UK, and he was talking about how he was seeing lights for Ramadan replacing lights for Easter. And he said, we in the UK are a, quote, Christian country in the sense that Dawkins expressed he's horrified by the way that Islamic holidays and mosques are taking the place of Christians' feasts and cathedrals in Europe. He said, if I had to choose between Christianity and Islam, I'd choose Christianity every single time. It seems to me to be a fundamentally decent religion in a way that Islam is not. I want to be clear here. My point is to not offer you a critique of Islam. My point is to show you that somebody who's devoutly an atheist is seeing now how the Christian ethos rooted in the law has impacted Western culture. The author of the article continues. He said, secularism and Dawkins' own brand of evangelical atheism are both expressions of a specifically Christian culture, as Dawkins himself, sitting on a branch he's been sawing through and gazing nervously at the ground far below, seems to have begun to realize. So he spent his whole life tearing down Christianity, and now he's going, I'm going to slow down a little bit because I think we might need this. Even if I don't believe in the theology of it, there's something about the Christian ethos, the Christian ethic, that has shaped us as a culture. The author continues and says, they're all right, of course. Dawkins' comments were a tacit admission that for decades now, he has been wrong to claim that science and secularism are the source of all that's good in Western culture. In fact, it is the worldview centered on a God who became man and died on a cross because he so loved the world that is the source of hospitals, churches, esteem for women and children, human rights, and even the music, art, and culture that Dawkins cherishes. For one of the world's most outspoken God haters to realize this is quite remarkable. I love when people who stand opposed to Christianity go, yeah, but there are some good things. Because see, Dawkins doesn't have a dog in the fight for Christianity. All his dogs are in the fight against Christianity. And yet he's realizing there's something about this ethical code that has grounded us for a very long time. And that goes back to the law we find in the Old Testament. Fully expressed later on in the New Testament in Jesus, but rooted back in that Old Testament law. So that's the moral law that Dawkins is seeing as influencing us. And so when you and I walk around in the world today, if somebody says to you, we don't need this, don't forget that image of sitting on a branch and cutting off the branch you're sitting on. We are rooted in an ethos that goes back to the Old Testament law and is fleshed out more fully in the New Testament law. We'll talk in a couple weeks about the topic of the Ten Commandments and where it does or does not fit in to our culture, but don't miss it. Our culture is rooted in a biblical understanding of what is good and true. So that's the moral law. Then we have the second law. It's called the civil law or the judicial law. And you and I, we know these laws today in our own world, right? So it's one thing to be found guilty of a criminal offense, and then there's other things that are like, hey, if you do this, you're probably going to get a fine, right? So my son Hudson and I, we've been fishing a lot this year. If I go out and fish without a license, I'm not going to get picked off by a sniper. That's not the way they do it. But if I do get found to be fishing without a license, which I do have, in case you're wondering, they will come and say, can I see your license? And if I say, no, I don't have one, I'll get a fine. There's a cost to not following the law. And that was true in the Old Testament as well. Look at this. It says, if an ox or a sheep was stolen and killed or sold, the thief had to restore 5 oxen for 1 ox and 4 sheep for 1 sheep. If you steal one, you got to pay it back multiple times over, and that's to motivate you not to steal. Okay, so there's an example of civil law. If a person's livestock ate another person's field, the owner had to make restitution from the best of their own field or vineyard. Different struggles than maybe what we face today. But if I lived in Old Testament times when I was young, I had a neighbor just up the road who had these wonderful raspberry bushes. And Brett and I would go into the neighbor's yard that we knew, which bordered the raspberry bushes, and we would eat raspberry bushes off this side of the bush so she couldn't see us from her house. Until the day she did. And she leaned over the raspberry bush and she said, because I was Timmy at that point, she said, hey, Timmy. And I looked up and I was like, come up with an excuse really quick. But before I could even say anything, she said, how do you think your dad would feel if I went to his garden and ate his vegetables? And I said to myself, not good. See, there's a moment where she's enforcing gently the civil law. If I lived in Old Testament times, I would have had to bring her to my house and given her 4 times the amount of raspberries back. You see, there's a place when she caught me, I was motivated to go, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to get in trouble. In the same way, if your livestock is roaming and is going to go destroy somebody else's land and you have to pay it back significantly, you're going to take better care of your livestock. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because we can look at the moral law and go, yeah, we shouldn't murder, we shouldn't kill. But even the civil law, especially in this time, you can see how it would make total sense. You can't just let your animals run amok. It's going to hurt the society. And so God gave them civil laws to follow. There's even a law that says at the end of the day, you have to pay your laborers for their work. Don't wait until the next day. Well, why? Because at the end of the day, people had to eat. And so if you didn't pay me and I didn't get either the food or the money I was supposed to be given, I might not have anything to provide for my family that night. So there was no of this, like, wait a couple weeks and we'll pay you. It was pay me at the end of the day so I can provide for myself. If you don't, there are consequences to that. Again, you and I look at that, we go, like, that makes sense for you and me even today. Do you see how when we stereotype the Old Testament laws, like, that's totally irrelevant, it has no place in our lives today, we're just like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now, again, there are parts of it and ways we have to understand it in light of Jesus, but let's not just toss out the whole thing. Here's some of the interesting laws for the Old Testament. How about this one? Newlyweds, or men who had just built a house or planted a vineyard, are legally exempt from military service for 1 year to care for their families or properties. That's pretty good sense, right? You planted something and they're like, okay, you don't have to go off to a campaign. You can stay home and raise up your family, or you can make sure that this crop that you just planted comes to fruition. Here's another one. A single witness is not considered sufficient to convict someone of a crime or a sin. You need the testimony of 2 or 3. You and I live this whenever we watch court TV. Not that I do, but I know that you do. No, but anytime you see anything having to do with our legal system today, you know if one person says X and the other person says Y, that's a tough situation for a jury to be in. So if you're trying to prosecute someone, you bring multiple witnesses. Sometimes it's people, sometimes it's computer records or cell phone data, but multiple witnesses are necessary to convict someone in most cases. So it's not just a he said, she said situation. That's rooted back in Old Testament law. You might know something that's interesting here, that you look at the moral law, like don't murder, and then you have like a court case where maybe somebody's accused of murder and you have to have multiple witnesses, and you see very clearly that the moral and the civil law and even the ceremonial law we'll talk about, they're all mixed together. They're all connected in some way. It's as if God was saying, I want to give you a whole picture of what it looks like to live rightly. So follow the moral law and follow the civil law as well. And then the last set of laws was called the ceremonial law, and this was about the sacrificial system that the Jewish people had. So you have 12 tribes in this Jewish nation, the nation of Israel, and one of the tribes is called the tribe of Levi. And the Levites are the one who serve in a priestly role. They were the pastors or priests of the time. And these are the ones who, when you came to make a sacrifice at the temple, they would play the in-between for you. So you would maybe come to the priest and say, these are the sins I've committed, and they would say, well, these are the things you need to make a sacrifice with in order to be restored to God. So they played a particular role at a particular time in this priestly system. So you would show up with an animal that maybe was wounded, and the priest would say, you're called to give your best to God, and so don't bring him a wounded animal. Go back and bring the best from your flock. And so the priest played this role of intermediary, and they also oversaw these days of celebration, Passover or Pentecost, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, things, various different celebrations that the Jewish people had. They would officiate these different celebrations. And so this was the ceremonial law. What do you do? What do you not do? How do you sacrifice? How do you not sacrifice? Now, interesting enough, look at the overlap here. If you came to a priest and said, hey, I got this rash on my hand, the priest would be the one who would tell you what to do to get away from camp to be quarantined. And the priest was the one who would come and check you after to make sure that you could be welcomed back into the camp. So priest and doctor as well. Interesting. Again, the mixing of the moral and the civil and the sacrificial law all tied together. Okay, so you've had your academic seminary class on the 3 areas of the law. Now the question for you and me should be, does this make a difference in our lives today? The answer is no. So I'm going to call the worship team back up. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, there are lots of applications for us. There are lots of applications. Number one, when you see a law that we follow in the United States of America, it would be interesting if you take the time to say, I wonder if we got that from anywhere in the Old Testament. And not just the United States of America, but in Western culture that's been greatly influenced by the Christian ethos. Just look and say, I wonder if there's a connection to the Old Testament. And all of a sudden, you'll see, again, that the foundation on which we stand in the Western world in particular is greatly influenced by the Old Testament law. So you'll just start to see the influence of that law from thousands of years ago in your life today. Here's the second thing. When you think about 613 laws that these people were called to follow, you can look and you can say confidently, thank God that I'm not under that system anymore. We'll talk about that when we land this series in looking at Jesus, but I can tell you, you can look at those laws and see the beauty and the space they have, but the question we ask now is not, do I follow that law or not follow that law, but to ask, what's the heart behind that law? When you read the Old Testament, look at the law and say, what am I learning about God, and what am I learning about God's desire for people to live well together when I look at that law? If you'll approach the Old Testament and the law that way, you will glean so much. And yes, there will still be verses that you'll go, I have no idea what that has to do with anything. But you'll start to see when you look at these different divisions of the law and understand the law, that it is still applicable at a heart and soul level to you today. Here's the last thing, is that as you understand these three areas of the law that we have in the Old Testament, again, you will start to see the beautiful narrative that God has painted from beginning to the point we are in now and into the fullness of time. God is writing a story. And if you skip the first 5 chapters, you don't understand the full story. If you skip understanding the law, you don't see how good you have it now, because you don't have to live under those commandments anymore. I want to close this by giving you a picture of the ceremonial law. When a sacrifice was made, it's easy for us to read those words on a page and to go, yeah, okay, so a sacrifice was made as far as the ceremonial law, and the Levites, they helped out with that. But I want you to think that when sins were committed, you brought this live animal, and this animal was put to death to show the seriousness, the implications of not following the righteous ways of God. So don't just read it and go like, yeah, okay, Levitical law, so they 2 turtle doves and a partridge in a pear tree. Okay, we're good. Look at it and think about the fact that a Levite priest would take the life of this animal with you nearby, and you would look and say, sin is a terrible, terrible thing. And that should press you to go, I want to move away from sin and move towards the holiness that God's called me to. Because James, the half-brother of Jesus in the New Testament, says, ultimately sin leads to death. And that's what we see painted in this sacrificial system. But thanks be to God for Jesus, who has offered us eternal life. Next week, when we look into the law, we're going to pick some of the weirdest ones and talk about them together. Fair warning, you'll walk out, I hope, going, oh, I see that in a new way. And there'll also be ways you walk out and you'll go, I'm still totally unsure about how that is a helpful law. That's okay. But don't let uncertainty push you into a place where you say, I'm just going to throw it out. Keep leaning in to see what God wants to teach you as we understand and apply appropriately the law and the Old Testament. Let's pray.